In the case of Lebanon, they did educate the civilian population. We should be honest about that. It was no doubt the reason why, during the massacre in Gaza, Hezbollah limited itself pretty much to just verbal support for Gaza. They didn't provide any military support because the population would have turned against Hezbollah, the Lebanese population. So they educated Lebanon, but, as I said earlier, they suffered a major military defeat. In the case of Gaza, they were both able to educate the civilian population, and they achieved a military victory, but we have to bear in mind how they achieved the victory. As Gideon Levy put it, the fighting in Gaza was war deluxe. Compared with previous wars, it is child's play. Pirates bombing unimpeded as if on practice runs, tank and artillery soldiers shelling houses and civilians from their armored vehicles, combat engineering troops destroying entire streets in their ominous protected vehicles without facing strong opposition. A large, broad army, our own, is fighting a helpless population and a weak, ragged organization that has fled the conflict zones and is barely putting up a fight. You could say, to Friedman's credit, I suppose, that he was candid about what was going on. Israel was trying to inflict a heavy pain on Gaza. But then there are others who couldn't rise to those standards of candor. For example, there's this guy, he's a very prominent military analyst in the United States. His name is Anthony Kordsman. And Kordsman is always interviewed at talk shows because he's an expert in the art of legal murder called war. And he writes a report a few weeks after the Gaza massacre. It came out 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago. It's called The Gaza War. And Mr. Kordsman, he goes to Israel on a trip paid for by the American Jewish Committee. He doesn't mention that in the report. And then he interviews all of these Israeli generals and officers. And he reads all of the Israeli press releases. In his report, he reproduces page after page after page of Israeli press releases. He says they contain very important insights, like Pravda used to contain during the Stalin era. And then he concludes, after his interviews with the Israeli generals and reading all these reports, he concludes Israel, quote, did not violate the laws of war. It was a beautiful war. It was very clean. He said he could only find one instance when Israel dropped, he gives a precise number, 20 phosphorus weapons in a civilian neighborhood. Only one instance where maybe Israel committed a war crime. Otherwise, it was a perfect war. Do you have any doubts? Just ask the Israeli generals. Well, it happens that today, Amnesty International produced a preliminary report, or published a preliminary report on what happened in Gaza. It's actually very much worth reading. I want to just quote one part of it. In the 3 weeks following the start of the Israeli military offensive, Israeli forces killed more than 1,300 Palestinians in Gaza, including more than 300 children and many other civilians, and injured over 5,000 other Palestinians. again including many civilians. Israeli forces also destroyed thousands of homes and other property and caused significant damage to the infrastructure of Gaza, causing a worsening of the humanitarian crisis arising from the blockade. Some of the Israeli bombardments and other attacks were directed at civilians or civilian buildings in the Gaza Strip. Others were disproportionate or indiscriminate. Amnesty International has found indisputable evidence that Israeli forces used white phosphorus, which has a highly incendiary effect in densely populated residential areas in Gaza, putting the Palestinian civilian population at high risk. Israeli forces' use of artillery and other non-precision weapons in a densely populated residential area increased the risk and the harm done to the civilian population. During the same period, Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continued to fire indiscriminate rockets into the residential areas of southern Israel, killing 3 civilians. And then they give the law. Direct attacks on civilians and civilian objects, disproportionate attacks, and indiscriminate attacks are war crimes. So every time Israel says, yeah, we use disproportionate force, every time they say that, they are acknowledging they are committing a war crime. And then they say at the end, which I think is very encouraging, it's a hopeful sign, they say Amnesty International is calling on the UN, notably the Security Council, to impose an immediate, comprehensive arms embargo on all parties to the conflict. And it's calling on all states to take action individually to impose national embargoes on any weapons or weapons transfers to the parties to the conflict until there is no longer a substantial risk that such arms or weapons could be used to commit serious violations of international law. I think that, as I said, is a hopeful sign because now we have Amnesty on our side to call for a full arms embargo on Israel for its commission of war crimes. That was one aspect, the deterrence capacity, restoring its deterrence capacity. But there was also a second aspect to Israel's massacre in Gaza, and that was because, as I said, the Palestinians were becoming too moderate. They were becoming too reasonable. And that's a real problem for Israel. For the past 3 decades, past 30 years, there's been a consensus in the international community on how to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. Most of you know it. You've heard it using the shorthand, the 2-state settlement of the conflict. And the 2-state settlement is very clear. It says Israel has to withdraw from all the territory it occupied in June 1967, the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, and the whole of East Jerusalem, because under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Israel acquired those territories in the course of the war. They have no title to them. As the highest judicial body in the world ruled, the International Court of Justice, the West Bank, Gaza, the whole of East Jerusalem are occupied Palestinian territories. Israel has to fully withdraw, and in turn, the newly formed Palestinian state has to recognize Israel's right, in accordance with the United Nations Charter, Israel's right to be free from the threat or use of force. That's the 2-state settlement, a settlement along the June 1967 border. There's no dispute in the real world about that. There's no controversy. There is no contention. It is not a complex or intricate conflict. Every year, the United Nations General Assembly votes on these terms for resolving the conflict. And every year, the vote is the same. the whole world on one side